14 ships in the trailing cluster, and I can only cover 9 of them. The formation plot on my console makes this obvious. A spray of blue icons drifting apart like seeds from a dead flower, and a red crescent of flock contacts tightening around the ones I can't reach. I've run the math 4 times. 4 times the same answer. The Crucible's point defense envelope covers what it covers, and everything outside that radius belongs to whatever wants it. The flock has been circling at standoff range for 6 hours, long enough to map the gaps, long enough to watch us try to close them and fail. "Cos, what's our window?" Captain Brassard from the command station behind me. He'd been reading cargo manifests, supply math, calorie projections, water margins, and the shift in his attention meant he could see the crescent forming too. "They'll commit within 12 hours, probably sooner." I tapped the plot, expanding the trailing cluster. Vennick's group is the problem. 4 ships, all heavy haulers, none of them capable of repositioning fast enough to tuck inside our umbrella. 2 are running manual overrides because their nav systems are commercial grade and can't hold assigned coordinates under thrust correction. Which 2? The Selrath and the Ganaway, both agricultural seed stock. The Ganaway also has 1,900 litres of purified water in reserve bladders strapped across her dorsal hull, which is why her thrust-to-mass ratio is the worst in the convoy. Brassard crossed to my station and studied the spread. He was 53, career Navy, 16 months from retirement when the sector fleet burned. Now he commanded the only warship left, a decommissioned Spear-class battleship dragged out of a heritage berth because everything else had been turned to wreckage and nursery material. His uniform still had a museum staff patch on the shoulder. He hadn't replaced it. I'd stopped noticing. "Can we push them?" "I've been trying." I keyed the short-range comm. "Vennick, this is Crucible Tactical. Your cluster needs to close the gap by at least 800 meters to fall inside point defense range. Acknowledge." The response took 20 seconds. Vennick was the master of the Selrath, a cargo hauler with a flat voice and a habit of treating every instruction as a suggestion. "Tactical, we've been burning corrections for the past 40 minutes. The Ganaway can't hold position." Her patch welds flex under sustained thrust, and Harco's worried about hull separation. "Put Harco on." "He's busy." "Vennick, in approximately 2 hours, that crescent out there is going to fold in on your cluster. If you're outside our umbrella when that happens, we watch you on sensors. That's all we do." Static. Then, "Stand by." I muted the channel and looked at Brassard. "If I push the military override codes, I can slave their engines to our formation computer, lock them into position whether they like it or not. Do it if you have to. It tells every civilian ship in the convoy that we can seize their engines at will. That's a conversation that doesn't go back in the box." Brassard rubbed the heel of his hand across his temple. He looked like a man calculating how many fires he could fight simultaneously and arriving at a number lower than the number of fires. "If they're dead, the conversation's academic. Push the codes." I reopened the channel. "Vennick, I'm transmitting override authorization to your navigation systems. Both ships. You'll see a lockout warning on your helm displays. Don't fight it. Don't try to countermand. The formation computer will hold your position. You can't just..." "I can. Crucible carries fleet contingency overrides for every civilian vessel in this convoy. I'm exercising them. If Harco's hull patches can't take sustained positioning thrust, he should have flagged that 6 hours ago instead of drifting 1.5 kilometers off his assigned mark." I cut the channel before Vennick could build momentum and transmitted the override package. On the plot, both ships shivered, their drive signatures spiking as the Crucible's formation computer grabbed their engines and began dragging them into alignment. It would take the better part of an hour to close the gap. The flock would see the movement and recalculate. That bought time, but not certainty. Brassard returned to his station. The bridge crew, 5 officers, 3 enlisted, all inherited from the museum's skeleton maintenance staff and cross-trained into combat roles with the kind of ugly improvisation that only desperation authorizes, went back to their consoles. Sensor Officer Pell tracked the crescent. Weapons Officer Davi, who had nothing to do until the spinal gun finished recharging in 17 days, monitored the point defense grid. Comms Officer Tadi managed 36 open channels to 36 civilian ships, most of which called in at least twice a watch to ask questions he couldn't answer. I worked the formation plot. The convoy was an ugly thing. 38 ships, down from 44 at the start, strung out across a ragged column that was supposed to be a tight defensive formation, but kept sagging and stretching as ships broke down, fell behind, drifted off course, or simply failed to follow instructions. The Crucible sat at the center, the only vessel with weapons, the only vessel with military-grade sensors, the only vessel that mattered to the flock. 18,000 people in those hulls. Cargo haulers, ore transports, a passenger liner, 2 medical frigates, a tanker, a livestock carrier that had dumped its livestock weeks ago and now served as overflow housing, and 1 cryogenetic ark the size of a city block carrying frozen seed stock, embryo banks, and the only surviving genetic library from Risoria Station. All of them depending on a gun that fired once every few weeks, and a tactical officer who had requested this posting specifically because he'd believed the weapon would never fire again. The irony had stopped being interesting about 3 sacrifices ago. The override worked. Venix's cluster crawled into range over the next 90 minutes, the Ganaway groaning through every correction. I could see it in the telemetry, stress warnings cascading from her portside hull patches, each one a yellow flag on my secondary display. Harko finally came on comms, not to argue but to report, in a tone emptied of everything except the report itself, that 3 of his reserve bladders had ruptured during the repositioning burn. 1,400 litres of purified water venting into vacuum from split seams. I logged it. The flock adjusted. The crescent widened, spreading its 15 raiders, 15 up from 9 when the convoy had formed, into 2 distinct groups. One held position on the trailing edge. The other drifted portside, slow and patient, settling into a corridor that my formation plot flagged immediately. I stared at it, ran the projection. "Captain." I turned in my chair. "They've split into hunting groups, standard pincer maneuver against the trailing cluster." Bressard crossed to me again. The bridge had gone quiet, the particular quiet of people who could read a tactical plot well enough to know what was coming, but not well enough to help. "The portside group is sitting in the gap between our point defense envelope and the 11-ship cluster on the convoy's left flank. If I swing us to cover Venix's trailing ships, those 11 are naked. If I hold position, the trailing cluster is inside our umbrella, but the portside group has a clean run at the flank. What's in the flank cluster? 11 ships, approximately 9,000 passengers total. 2 of them are the Oral and the Vestaine, our only medical vessels." Bressard absorbed this. His eyes moved across the plot the way a man's hands move across a wound, quick, searching, already knowing the answer but needing to confirm it with pressure. "And the trailing cluster? 4 ships, agricultural haulers. Combined population maybe 300 crew. All crew, no passengers. Critical cargo, but replaceable if we ever reach a resupply point." He stepped back, crossed his arms, uncrossed them. "Which cluster do you protect?" The question was a formality. We both knew the answer, had known it since the crescent first appeared. Population density trumped cargo value. Medical assets trumped everything. That was the obscenity of it. "Portside flank. We hold position and keep the 11-ship cluster inside our umbrella. The trailing 4 fall outside point defense range." Recommendation noted. He took a breath. "Transmit the new formation plot." I transmitted it. On 36 screens across the convoy, the formation display updated. Ships shuffled into new positions, blue icons tightening around the Crucible's center point, the portside cluster drawing closer, the trailing 4 pushed to the edge of the plot, and then beyond it, outside the blue circle that marked our point defense coverage. Outside anything. The response took less than a minute. The comm station chimed, Venix's frequency. Taddy glanced at me. I nodded. Vennick's voice came through, stripped of the earlier stubbornness, stripped of everything except the need to understand. Tactical. I'm looking at the updated formation plot. My cluster is outside the defense perimeter. Is this correct? One sentence. Calm, flat. No accusations, no bargaining. Just a man reading a display and asking someone to confirm what the display was telling him, because the alternative was that the display was wrong and there was still time. That's correct, Vennick. Your cluster is outside point defense range for this engagement cycle. Recommend you reduce signature emissions and maintain minimal thrust until the threat passes. Reduce signature, maintain minimal thrust. Go quiet and hope the flock picks someone else. Knowing the flock doesn't pick, it calculates. The channel stayed open for 3 or 4 seconds after I finished speaking. Then it closed. 11 hours. The flock committed just after the watch change, the port side group feinting toward the main formation to test our point defense tracking, while the trailing group dropped the pretense of circling and drove straight for Vennick's cluster. I watched on long-range sensors from the tactical station, where I'd been sitting since the formation order went out. Pell kept the feed clean. Davi ran the point defense grid on automatic, swatting at the feinting group whenever a raider drifted close enough to trigger engagement protocols. The rest of the bridge waited. On the sensor display, the trailing group hit the Selrath first. 3 raiders moving in a triangle formation. They matched velocity with the hauler, latched onto her dorsal hull near the engine fairings, and began cutting. Pell magnified the feed and I could see it. Bright lines of thermal activity tracing across the Selrath's hull plates as the raiders opened her up with tools or limbs or whatever the flock used. It took less than 20 minutes. The Selrath's drive signature died. Her running lights went dark in a cascade from bow to stern, and the thermal lines multiplied, spreading across the hull like cracks in ice. Vennick was on that ship. I didn't know if he was alive during the cutting or if the breach killed everyone fast. The sensors couldn't tell me, and I didn't look for ways to find out. The second ship, the Ganaway, Harco's leaking hauler, tried to run, burned her damaged engines hard enough to split 2 more hull patches, venting atmosphere from her port compartments in white plumes that the sensors painted as temperature differentials. She managed maybe 4 minutes of acceleration before a pair of raiders caught her and attached to her stern. The cutting began there too. The other 2 ships in the cluster, smaller utility haulers I'd never spoken to, fired their engines at maximum burn the moment the Selrath was hit. One of them, the Paro, made it. Enough thrust, enough distance, enough time to pull clear while the flock was occupied with the larger prizes. She limped back toward the formation over the next several hours, her engine running rough but functional. The other, a boxy transport called the Myron, took a raider hit during her burn. Something caught her aft quarter and tore her main thruster housing loose. She drifted, powerless, for 2 hours before a raider detached from the Ganaway's wreckage and collected her. 3 ships. I updated the tally. 44 at the start, 38 before today, 35 now. The Paro reached the formation perimeter 8 hours after the attack. I guided her into a berth position between 2 ore carriers and locked her navigation to the formation computer. Her captain, a young man named Steele, came on comms to report his ship's status. Hull intact, engines functional but degraded, crew of 12, all present. He didn't ask about Vennick or Harco. He didn't ask about anything. 30 hours later, the dead watch. The bridge was dim, half the stations unmanned, Pell running sensors alone while the rest of the crew cycled through their sleep shifts. I should have been in my rack. I'd been on duty for 22 hours before the attack and hadn't left the bridge since, which put me somewhere past 40 hours awake and into the territory where the edges of the tactical plot blurred, if I stared at them too long. But the gun was 17 days out, and the flock was still circling, and leaving the bridge felt like leaving a wound unattended. Pell's voice cut through the quiet. New contacts, bearing 175, range 42,000, emerging from the rubble field. The field where the Selrath, The Ganaway and the Myron had been taken apart. I pulled up the sensor feed. 6 contacts. Small, fast-moving, radiating construction heat. Thermal signatures still bright against the cold of the rubble cloud they were leaving. Moving in formation, tight, coordinated, already oriented toward the convoy. 6 new raiders, Pell confirmed. His voice had the careful flatness of a man who understood what he was reporting and had decided to report it cleanly anyway. Drive signatures are active. Formation configuration is consistent with standard flock hunting patterns. 6. From 3 dead ships, built in 30 hours. I ran the silhouette analysis. The sensor computer painted wireframe projections of each new contact based on radar returns and thermal profiles, rotating them on my display in slow, false color. I recognized the Raider chassis. The same elongated, asymmetric bodies we'd been tracking for weeks, grown from materials the flock stripped from consumed vessels. But the details were wrong. 2 of the new Raiders carried antenna arrays on their dorsal surfaces, tall, branching structures that looked nothing like standard flock architecture. I overlaid the Selrath's manifest schematics, and the match was immediate. Cargo telemetry antennae, the kind Venix hauler used to track container positions during loading operations, ripped from the Selrath and grafted onto a Raider's hull, still carrying the manufacturer's design. Another Raider had thruster pods mounted at angles that made no sense for its body shape, until I overlaid the Ganaway's engine configuration and saw that the pods were Harco's maneuvering thrusters, transplanted wholesale, still bearing the mounting brackets and fuel line connections of a human-built ship. The flock hadn't just eaten them, it had worn them, taken their components and integrated them into new bodies, building Raiders that carried pieces of the convoy's own dead like grafted limbs. I saved the silhouette overlays and stared at the plot. 21 Raiders now, up from 15. 6 of them wearing the antennae and thrusters and hull plating of ships I'd ordered outside the defense perimeter 2 days ago. Pell watched me from his station. He didn't ask what I was going to do about it. There was nothing to do about it. The gun was 17 days from ready. The point defense grid could handle small incursions, and the flock had just demonstrated that every ship it took didn't just cost us tonnage. It gave them materials, components, and, if those cargo telemetry antennae still functioned, data. Navigation logs, frequency tables, formation protocols. Everything stored in a dead ship's computer, now wired into something that wanted the rest of us. I closed the silhouette overlays, pulled up a fresh formation plot, and started working. The council wanted faces. I gave them a screen. 3 captains elected to speak for the civilian ships. Desh of the Laramine, a passenger liner carrying 2,000. Galt of the Vestarn, one of our 2 medical frigates. And Pren of the ore carrier Blackwall, who'd been a Union arbitrator before the evacuation and brought those instincts to every conversation. They sat in the Laramine's wardroom, and I sat at my tactical station, and we talked through the comlink while I watched the flock circle on the plot behind their faces. 6 days since the breeding. The gun was 11 days from ready. 21 Raiders in the flock now, holding at standoff range, and I'd been tracking a slow change in their patrol pattern that I hadn't yet reported to Bressard because I wasn't sure what it meant. We've reviewed the formation orders from the last 3 repositioning cycles, Pren started. He had a measured way of speaking that made everything sound like a contract negotiation. The inner ring, the ships closest to the Crucible, hasn't changed in composition since the convoy formed. The same vessels occupy the safest positions every cycle. We'd like to understand the selection criteria. I'd expected this conversation, surprised it had taken this long. The inner ring is assigned based on asset irreplaceability. The Oral and the Vestane are our only medical-capable ships. The Kindara is the cryogenetic ark. Frozen seed stock, embryo banks, the Resoria genetic library. The Halleck is the fuel tanker that keeps the Crucible operational. Those 4 stay inside the point defense envelope at all times because losing any one of them cripples the convoy permanently. And the rest of us rotate through the outer positions. Desh. He was younger than I'd expected from his voice. Maybe mid-30s, with the build of someone who'd kept himself fit in low gravity and the expression of someone running the same math I ran. Except his variables were people he'd looked in the eye. The positions where the flock can reach us. The outer positions are rotated to distribute risk. No single ship stays exposed for more than 2 cycles. Except the ones that do. The Paro has been in the trailing quadrant for 3 consecutive cycles. The Mossbank spent 4 straight repositions on the convoy's portside edge before Galt petitioned to have her moved. He'd been tracking. I hadn't expected that. The Paro has degraded engines from the last attack. She can't reposition fast enough to take a central berth without disrupting the formation during transition. The Mossbank situation was a scheduling error I corrected. A scheduling error. Desh leaned forward. His wardroom was visible behind him. The passenger liner's officer's mess converted into a makeshift administrative center. Charts and manifests pinned to the walls with medical tape. Cos, I have 2,000 people on this ship. Families, children. The Laramine is a passenger liner. She was built to carry people between stations, not to survive in a combat formation. Every time you put us in an outer ring position, you're betting those 2,000 lives that the flock will attack somewhere else. And I can see on the formation plot that ships carrying cargo get the same protection tier as ships carrying people, so long as the cargo is on your critical list. That's correct. So my ship, 2,000 living human beings, is less valuable to this formation than a freezer full of embryos. In formation terms, yes. The silence that followed had weight. Galt shifted in his chair. He'd been quiet until now. The doctor who'd ended up captaining a medical frigate because every officer above him had died in the initial flock engagement. He cleared his throat. Cos, I think what Captain Desh is asking, I understand what he's asking. I kept my eyes on Desh's face on my screen. The Laramine carries people. The Kindara carries the genetic future of the evacuation. If I lose the Laramine, 2,000 people die and the convoy is diminished. If I lose the Kindara, the convoy reaches its destination. If it reaches its destination, without the ability to rebuild a viable gene pool, the Kindara gets the inner ring. The Laramine rotates through outer positions with every other non-critical vessel. Non-critical. Desh repeated it the way a man repeats a diagnosis. Pren intervened before the word could finish landing. We're logging a formal protest with Captain Bressard. We're not asking you to change the formation priorities, Cos. We're asking for transparency. Publish the criteria. Let every captain see the ranking. And consider a weighted rotation that accounts for passenger density, not just cargo classification. I'll take it to the captain. The link closed. I turned back to the tactical plot, and the thing that had been nagging me for 2 days finally had a shape. The flock had repositioned during the call. The drift was small, a few hundred meters across several raiders, the sort of shift I'd normally tag as patrol adjustment. But I'd been overlaying flock positions against a timeline, and the cumulative pattern was wrong. I pulled up the convoy's formation layout from 12 days ago, before the last repositioning, before the attack on Venix's cluster, and laid it beside the flock's current arrangement. The flock's raider crescent matched the convoy's old formation screen, the screen we'd used 2 weeks ago before I'd changed it. I stared at the overlay, adjusted for scale, checked it again. 15 of the 21 raiders were arranged in a formation that mirrored the defensive perimeter I'd drawn around the convoy on day 19 of the evacuation, a perimeter I'd since abandoned. The flock was flying a formation the convoy had stopped using almost 2 weeks ago, and the match was close enough that the sensor computer flagged it as a 92% correlation when I ran the pattern recognition. Pell. I didn't look up from the overlay. When did the flock last change its patrol formation? He checked his logs. Gradual shift over the past 3 days. I logged it as standard behavioral drift. It wasn't drift. The flock was reproducing a human formation pattern, one it could only have learned from the navigational data stored in the ships it had consumed. The Selrath, the Ganaway, and the Myron had all carried copies of the Convoy's formation history in their nav computers. Standard procedure. Every ship in the Convoy received updated formation plots every cycle, and those plots accumulated in the nav logs along with every previous iteration. The flock had eaten the logs, and now it was flying them. I saved the overlay and opened the comm station from my console. Taddy, pull up the frequency allocation table. I need a full audit of every channel the Convoy has used since departure, active and abandoned. Taddy looked up from his station across the bridge. He was the youngest officer aboard, 24, former museum communications technician, the kind of person who understood radio equipment the way some people understood plumbing. That's a lot of channels. Start with the ones we stopped using, specifically the old merchant coordination frequency, the one we retired 10 days ago after the IFF update. He worked for several minutes. I watched the flock on the plot, looking for more patterns, trying to see what else it might have learned from the dead ship's computers. Formation history, frequency tables, engine specifications, crew manifests, everything a commercial nav system stores, which is almost everything. COS. Taddy's voice had changed. I'm picking up short burst transmissions on the retired merchant frequency. Low power, intermittent. They started... He scrolled through his log. At least 3 days ago. Source? Bearing matches the flock's outer patrol ring. He paused, listening through his headset, adjusting filters. The signal format is... It's using our call sign protocol. Specifically, the call signs assigned to the Selrath and the Ganaway. Dead ships, dead call signs, broadcasting from the flock. Are any of our ships responding? Taddy ran the check. His face did something complicated, a series of micro-expressions that started with confusion and ended somewhere closer to nausea. 2 ships have sent automated handshake responses on that frequency in the past 72 hours. The Paro and the Enith. Their comm systems still had the old frequency in their active response tables. They've been broadcasting position updates to what their computers think are convoy partners. Position updates. Course, speed, bearing. Everything the flock needed to map the convoy's real-time layout, delivered voluntarily by ships whose automated systems didn't know their correspondents were dead. Kill the frequency. Kill every retired frequency. Wipe the old call signs from every ship's response table and push new ones through the override network. I was already drafting the comms architecture changes on my console. New frequency allocation, new call signs, manual-only hails, no automated handshakes on any channel. Nothing goes out without a human hand on the transmit key. That's going to take hours. I'll need cooperation from every ship's comms officer, and half of them don't have dedicated comms officers. They're running automated systems because they don't have the crew. Then it takes hours. Start now. Taddy started. I pulled up the formation plot and drew a ring around the Paro and the Enith, trying to calculate how much positional data the flock had harvested from their automated responses. 3 days of broadcasts, course corrections, speed changes, formation updates, a moving map of the convoy's interior layout handed over for free. Bressard appeared at my shoulder. He'd been in his day cabin when the council call happened. I'd briefed him by message after, and he'd acknowledged without comment. Now he studied the overlay I'd left on my secondary display. The flock's patrol pattern matched against our old formation screen. How certain? 92% geometric correlation, and they're using our dead ship's call signs to harvest position data from the convoy. 2 ships have been responding automatically for 3 days. He absorbed this the way he absorbed everything. A slow compression of the face, the eyes tracking across the data as if looking for an exit that wasn't there. What do they want with our formation patterns? I don't know yet, but they're collecting them, and they're flying them. And that means every ship we lose doesn't just feed their production line, it feeds their intelligence. They're getting smarter on our own data. Recommendations? New comms architecture, which Taddy's already building. And when the gun is ready, we need to make the shot count. If the flock has our formation history, it knows our defensive patterns, which means it knows where our gaps tend to form and when. We're predictable to them now in ways we can't fully map. He nodded and went back to his station, and I went back to the problem that was sitting underneath all the other problems, like a stone at the bottom of a well. The gun was 11 days out. One shot, weeks to recharge after. The spinal discharge could crack a moon. It could obliterate every raider in the flock if they were clustered tight enough. But the flock didn't cluster. It spread, patrolled, maintained spacing. A dispersed target. And if the flock had access to our navigational hazard data, which it did because every consumed ship carried standard hazard libraries, then it knew the gun's threat radius, its discharge cone profile, its effective range against distributed targets. To make the shot work, I needed the flock to concentrate, and the only thing that made the flock concentrate was prey. The comms overhaul took Taddy and a rotating team of civilian operators the better part of 2 days. New frequencies, new call signs, manual-only transmission protocols pushed to every ship through the override network. Some captains cooperated immediately, others demanded explanations. Desh wanted to know why his comms officer, a passenger liner's entertainment systems technician doing his best in a job he'd never trained for, had to manually reprogram 47 frequency registers when nobody had told him the old ones were compromised. I explained, briefly. Desh's response was a 3-second silence followed by, "So the flock has been listening to us talk. Listening and responding. On frequencies we thought were dead." Another silence. "What else has it learned?" "I'm working on that." I was. Between the comms overhaul and the gun timeline, I spent every available hour on the flock's behavioral data, mapping its patrol shifts against the convoy's repositioning history, looking for correlations beyond the formation mirror I'd already found. The picture that emerged was incomplete but consistent. The flock adapted. Every ship it consumed made it marginally more fluent in human systems. Still something different from human intelligence, but responsive, reactive, capable of recognizing patterns and reproducing them. It learned the way water learns a landscape, flowing into whatever channels already exist. The gun reached charge status on the morning of the 11th day. Davy confirmed it from the weapons station. Spinal capacitor banks at full, discharge alignment nominal, targeting computer online and waiting for a solution. The first time in weeks the crucible had teeth. One bite, then weeks of nothing. I brought the firing problem to Bressard. The flock is dispersed across a patrol arc, roughly 18,000 meters wide. The gun's effective kill cone at this range is 1,200 meters at maximum spread. If I fire into the densest cluster right now, I take out maybe 4 raiders, 5 if the fragmentation pattern cooperates. That leaves 16, and we've just announced our position and started another recharge cycle. What do you need? Concentration. If the flock bunches to attack, the kill cone covers more of them. The tighter they pack, the more we take with one shot. Ideal scenario is a full assault run, all 21 raiders converging on a single target. Fire into the convergence point and we could break them. They won't converge on us. They've never come at the crucible directly. No, they converge on the ships they're hunting. If I position a target at the right distance from our firing solution, something with enough mass and signature to draw a full attack run, and time the shot for the moment of convergence. Bressard looked at me. The look went on long enough that I could feel the bridge crew pretending not to watch. You want to bait them. I want to use the formation setup to create a kill window. Yes, that means putting a ship where the flock will commit maximum force, and firing through the engagement zone. Which ship? I'd already run the candidates. Mass, signature profile, position relative to the optimal firing arc, ability to reposition to the bait point within the available time window. The answer was clean and ugly, and I'd known it before I started the calculation. The Laramine, Desh's liner. She has the largest radar cross-section of any non-military ship in the convoy. Her passenger deck thermal output makes her the brightest target on the flock's sensors, and she can reposition to the bait coordinates within 6 hours using standard thrust. You just told the man his ship was non-critical. Now you want to use it as bait. I want to position it where the flock will attack in force. The Crucible fires when the flock converges. The Laramine starts her burn away from the engagement zone before the shot. If the timing works, she clears the discharge cone with margin. Brassard walked to the viewport, a wide slab of reinforced composite that showed nothing but black and the faint running lights of the nearest convoy ships. He stood there long enough for the watch officer to glance at me and look away. When he turned back, the museum patch shoulder was facing me, and I could read the heritage crest. Crucible. Commissioned 2094. Decommissioned 2181. Preserved in honor of those who served. I'm not transmitting that order. Captain, you transmit it. Your formation, your firing solution, your recommendation. He crossed back to his station and sat down. I'll authorize the shot when it's time, but the repositioning call goes out under your name to every ship in the convoy, so that every captain in this fleet knows exactly who is asking them to do what. The decision made sense. He was tired of carrying the face of a system he hadn't built, and the man who had built it was sitting 8 feet away at the tactical console. I opened the convoy-wide channel and transmitted the new formation plot. Every ship received the updated positions simultaneously. Every captain could see the shape. The Laramine pushed out to a forward position, alone, 8,000 meters ahead of the main formation, sitting in open space like a staked animal. The acknowledgements came in one by one. Tardy logged them. Most were terse, position confirmed, beginning repositioning burn, professional, obedient. The resignation I'd been seeing for days, refined now into something harder, something that operated like discipline but came from a different place. Desh didn't acknowledge. For 20 minutes, the Laramine sat motionless on the plot, while every other ship shifted around her. Then her drive signature flared, but in the wrong direction. The Laramine wasn't burning toward the bait coordinates. She was burning toward the center of the convoy at full thrust, her 2,000-passenger bulk driving straight into the heart of the formation like a fist through a web. Desh is breaking formation. Pell, calm and factual, already tracking the ripple effects. 3 ships in his path, the Enith, the Blackwall, and the Paro, are executing emergency avoidance burns. The formation is... I could see what the formation was. The Laramine punching through the carefully arranged formation like a rock through a window. Ships scattering, drive signatures flaring as captains fired maneuvering thrusters to avoid collision. A gap opening on the convoy's trailing edge where the Enith and the Paro had been sitting before the Laramine forced them aside. A gap the flock had been waiting for. On the sensor plot, 4 raiders broke from the patrol arc and drove for the breach at full acceleration. The rest of the flock held position, disciplined, patient, watching to see what the gap would yield. 2 choices. Swing the Crucible to plug the gap with point defense fire and block the spinal gun's firing arc, which killed the shot I'd spent days preparing. Or hold position, keep the firing arc clear, and let the flock pour through the breach into the scattered ships. The 4 raiders were 12,000 meters from the gap and closing at combat speed. The Enith and the Paro and the Blackwall were tumbling away from the Laramine's path, their formation berths abandoned, their engines firing in panicked, uncoordinated bursts that did nothing except push them further from the convoy's protection. I held position. The flock hit the gap, and kept going. 3 of the 4 raiders blew past the scattered ships and pulled into a holding pattern beyond the convoy, probing, testing, mapping the new layout of the broken formation. One raider peeled off toward the Enith, then adjusted, circled the Paro, and settled on the smallest and slowest ship in the scatter, a utility vessel called the Bren. 19 crew, manual helm, unarmed, unarmored, slow. The raider matched velocity with the Bren and latched on. I watched the thermal lines begin, the same bright tracery I'd seen on the Selrath, cutting paths across the hull, systematic, almost surgical. The Bren's drive signature died within 8 minutes. Her running lights followed. The other scattered ships, the Enith, the Paro, the Blackwall, burned hard for the main formation, and this time the flock let them go. 1 ship was enough. 34 ships in the convoy now. The gap closed as the scattered vessels staggered back into position. The Laramine sat at the center of the formation where Desh had driven her, occupying a berth that wasn't hers, surrounded by ships that had nearly died dodging her. Tadi looked at me. Desh is hailing. Wants to talk to the captain. Tell him the captain is unavailable. I was already redrawing the formation plot around the new reality. The Laramine wedged into the core. The gap she'd created, the ships she'd displaced. Tell him to hold position and stand by for updated formation orders. And the Bren? 19 crew, a utility vessel, manual helm. Log it. Tadi logged it. The bridge settled into the silence that follows a thing that can't be taken back. Bressard sat at his station and read reports. Pell tracked the flock. Davi watched the point defense grid. I worked the formation plot, fitting the surviving ships into a shape that covered as many as possible with the tools I had. And somewhere outside the convoy, a raider was taking the Bren apart and feeding her 19 crew and her navigation logs and her frequency tables and her copy of every formation plot I'd ever transmitted into whatever the flock was becoming. Bressard found me an hour later, still at the console. The bridge was cycling through a watch change. He stood beside my station and spoke without looking at the plot. The next formation call is yours, start to finish. You build it, you transmit it, you answer for it. I'll authorize weapons release when you ask. Everything else is your name on the order. I kept my eyes on the display. Understood. Koss. He waited until I looked at him. His face was the face of a man who'd spent weeks signing orders he didn't write, and the last signature had cost him something he couldn't get back. You're better at this than anyone I've ever served with. That's not a compliment. He left the bridge. I turned back to the plot. 21 raiders and a fresh kill. The gun was charged, but the flock was dispersed again. The convergence window gone. The shot I'd designed wasted by Desh's break. I'd need a new firing solution, a new formation, a new way to concentrate the flock without a bait ship, because no captain in the convoy would accept that position now, after the Bren. On the comms panel, a priority alert chimed. Tadi's frequency audit system flagging anomalous traffic. I opened it and listened. A voice on the convoy's new primary coordination channel. Low power, short burst, using the call sign format Tadi had designed 2 days ago. The call sign belonged to the Bren, which was dead, which had been dead for less than 3 hours. The flock was already wearing her voice, and somewhere in the convoy, an automated system on a ship whose comms officer hadn't finished the manual override conversion was preparing to answer. I killed the transmission, locked the channel, and started the override sequence for every ship in the fleet. My hands were steady. They were always steady. That was the worst part. I'd been awake for something close to 30 hours when I found it. The bridge was running on a skeleton watch. Pell at sensors, Tadi monitoring the newly locked comms architecture, Davi babysitting the charged gun. Bressard was in his day cabin. The rest of the crew was cycling through mandated sleep shifts that I kept exempting myself from, because the formation plot wouldn't leave me alone and nobody outranked me on tactical decisions anymore. The gun had been ready for 16 hours. 16 hours of carrying the only weapon that mattered, and having nowhere to point it. The flock was dispersed across its patrol arc, 22 raiders now, the Bren's wreckage having yielded one new unit overnight, spread too wide for the spinal discharge to catch more than a handful. Firing into that spread was worse than not firing. It would announce our position, start the recharge clock, and leave us toothless for weeks, with most of the flock intact. So I sat at the tactical console and did what I'd been doing since Bressard handed me the reins. I studied the formation plot. Every repositioning order I'd given since the convoy formed, every shift, every rotation, every sacrifice call, and its aftermath. Weeks of decisions layered on a single composite display, each one a thin line showing where the convoy had been and where I'd moved it next. I'd started the composite looking for a new way to bait the flock into concentration. What I found was something else. Viewed as a time-lapse, the convoy's formation had been rotating. Slowly, a few degrees per cycle, masked by the chaos of individual repositioning calls and emergency adjustments. But the trend was there, consistent across every cycle, and the rotation was accompanied by a gradual flattening. The convoy's original formation had been a rough sphere, ships clustered in 3 dimensions around the crucible's center point. Now it was an oblate disk, thinning cycle by cycle, presenting more and more of its cross-section along a single plane, like a hand being forced open. I checked the rotation against the flock's attack history. Every engagement followed the same pattern. The flock pressured a specific quadrant. The convoy contracted away from the pressure, and the new formation settled into a configuration slightly more rotated, slightly more flattened than the one before. I'd responded to each attack with what looked like the optimal defensive adjustment, tightening the formation, closing gaps, redistributing ships to cover the breach. And every optimal adjustment had moved the convoy in the same direction. The flock had been choosing its targets to produce specific repositioning responses. It was herding, using our own formation to steer us. Every attack on the trailing cluster, every gap exploited, every ship sacrificed. Each one pushed the convoy through a rotation I'd calculated myself, using math that was correct and conclusions that were exactly what the flock wanted. I pulled the convoy's current configuration off the composite and rotated it on my display, looking at it from the angle the flock would see. An oblate disk, engines canted 20 degrees off the central axis, the crucible's spinal gun masked behind the bulk of the inner ring ships, the convoy's belly, the soft ventral aspect where the least armored hulls presented their broadest profiles, tilting into open space. I didn't recognize the shape, but the shape was too specific, too consistent across too many cycles to be accidental. The flock was building something with my formations, and I couldn't see what. I searched the Crucible's tactical database, modern fleet doctrine, standard formation libraries, combat geometries from the past century. Nothing matched. The convoy's current silhouette didn't correspond to any known defensive or offensive posture. Then I searched the Heritage Archive. The Crucible had been a museum ship. Her computer still carried the full educational archive that had been broadcast on public heritage frequencies during her years as a static display. Centuries of naval doctrine, historical fleet actions, tactical evolution from the earliest deep space engagements to the modern era. Thousands of formation templates, most of them obsolete, preserved for academics and school children. The match came back in under a second. 97% geometric correlation. Colonial fleet surrender posture. Codified during the Brevari Compact Wars, circa 2112. A formation adopted by a defeated fleet to signal total capitulation. Engines exposed and canted away from the victor. Weapons masked or powered down. Ventral hull presented broadside to demonstrate vulnerability. The posture was designed to be unmistakable. A ship or fleet in this posture could not maneuver, could not fire, and could not retreat. It was the spatial equivalent of kneeling with your neck exposed. The convoy was 80% into this posture. 2 more repositioning cycles, 2 more rounds of flock pressure, and my careful, rational, defensive responses, and the posture would complete. I sat with the overlay on my screen until the watch changed and Pell's replacement had to ask me twice if I needed anything. The Heritage Archive entry included a note on the posture's broadcast history, transmitted on standard educational frequencies from Crucible's Heritage berth, available to all vessels with public archive access. Every civilian ship in the sector would have cached the broadcast. Every ship the flock had consumed carried a copy. The flock hadn't invented this. It had found it in our own records, filed under the section on how humans surrender, and spent weeks engineering the convoy into position, using my own tactical logic as the mechanism. It didn't need to understand the symbolism. The physical configuration of the surrender posture, engines exposed, weapons masked, belly broadside, was also the most vulnerable posture a fleet could occupy against a massed assault. Maximum target area, minimum defensive capability, no escape trajectory. If the convoy completed the posture and the flock attacked in force, it was over. Every ship visible, every engine exposed, the Crucible's gun blocked behind the formation's own mass. I keyed the intercom to Bressard's cabin. He answered on the second tone, awake, his voice carrying the rough edge of a man who'd been lying in the dark, waiting for exactly this kind of call. "I need you on the bridge." He was there in 4 minutes. I showed him the composite, the rotation trend, the surrender posture overlay. I showed him the Heritage Archive match and the broadcast history. He absorbed it standing, one hand on the console frame, his eyes moving across the data the way they always did, searching for the exit, not finding it. "How long until the posture completes?" "At the current rate of flock pressure and our projected defensive responses, 2 repositioning cycles, maybe 36 hours, depending on when they hit us next. So stop responding. Hold the current formation. If I hold this formation and the flock attacks the exposed quadrant, I lose the ships in that quadrant. The survivors reposition on their own, panic burns, emergency avoidance, the same scatter we saw when Desh broke. The resulting configuration will be worse than anything I'd calculate, and it'll still advance the rotation because the flock chooses where to pressure. Then reposition against the rotation, move the convoy in the opposite direction. I've run it." I pulled up the projections. Every counter-rotation I can calculate either opens a gap the flock will exploit in the next attack cycle, which costs ships and feeds their production, or requires moving the inner ring assets out of the point defense envelope, which I can't do without risking the medical ships and the Ark. He looked at me. The Heritage crest on his shoulder caught the bridge light. "What can you do?" "Fire the gun. Now, while it's charged, before the flock pressures us into the final rotation. But the flock is dispersed. I need them concentrated to make the shot count, and the only thing that concentrates them is an attack run on a viable target. We already tried that. Desh, I know. No captain will accept a bait position. But there's one configuration that solves both problems simultaneously. I brought up the firing solution I'd been building for the past 2 hours. The one I'd run 3 times, hoping the numbers would change. The gun's bore axis runs through the center of the formation on the current alignment. If I reposition the inner ring ships, the Oral, the Vestane, the Kindara, and the Halleck, forward along the bore axis, it does 2 things. First, it breaks the surrender posture by placing mass where the flock's target posture expects empty space. The rotation stalls. Second, it clears the firing lane on the opposite side of the formation, giving me a clean shot into whatever's behind us. You said the flock is dispersed. What's behind us? Right now, the densest raider cluster. 14 of 22, holding in a trailing arc. They've been concentrating there for the past 6 hours. I think they're staging for the next pressure cycle, the one that would push us into the final rotation. If I fire through the bore axis into that cluster, I catch the majority of the flock in a single discharge. Bressard looked at the firing solution, I watched him find the problem. It took about 10 seconds. The inner ring ships will be in the bore axis when you fire. Yes. The discharge cone extends 300 meters in diameter at the bore axis distance where the inner ring ships would be positioned. The Oral, the Vestane, the Kindara, and the Halleck will be inside the cone. They'll be destroyed. The Halleck, the fuel tanker. I can reposition outside the cone with a delayed burn. She's small enough and fast enough to clear in time. The other three, I let the sentence end where it ended. The Oral and the Vestane, both medical ships, every surgeon, every pharmacy, every surgical suite and recovery ward the convoy had left. And the Kindara, the cryogenetic ark carrying the frozen seed stock and embryo banks, and the only surviving genetic library from Resoria Station. The irreplaceable assets. The entire reason the inner ring existed. You built the triage system to protect those ships. I built it to protect the convoy. The triage priorities made sense when the threat was attrition, losing ships one by one to flock raids. They don't make sense when the threat is total destruction. If the flock completes the surrender posture and attacks in force, every ship dies. The medical frigates, the Ark, the liner, all of them. Sacrificing 3 ships to break the posture and cripple the flock is the only calculation that preserves the majority. The convoy loses its medical capacity and its genetic reserves, and it arrives at its destination, if it arrives, without the ability to treat serious casualties or rebuild a gene pool. Yes. Brassard stepped back from the console. He looked at the bridge, at Pell, at Tardy, at Darby sitting beside a weapon that could crack moons, at the viewport and the black beyond it, and the faint lights of 34 ships carrying what was left. Is there another option? I've spent 2 hours looking for one. He turned back to me. Whatever he'd been carrying since the evacuation, the weight of command, the museum patch, the sense that this was someone else's ship being used for someone else's war, it was gone. What was left was simpler and harder. Transmit the order. I transmitted it. On 34 screens, the formation plot updated. The Oral, the Vestan, and the Kindara, the protected ships, the untouchable inner ring, the assets I'd built every formation around for weeks, slid forward along the bore axis into positions that any competent officer could read at a glance. The bore axis, the gun's throat. Acknowledgements from the Oral and the Vestane came within minutes. Brief, professional. Both captains were former Navy. Galt, on the Vestane, had served under Brassard years ago, before the museum posting. They understood bore axis positioning. They understood what it meant when the only gun in the fleet needed a clear lane, and your ship was in it. The Kindara was slower. Her captain, a civilian named Marrett, an archivist by training who'd been managing the genetic library when the evacuation swept him into command, came on comms and asked a question. Tactical. I'm looking at the updated formation plot. The Kindara is positioned on the spinal gun's bore axis. Is this correct? The same words, the same cadence, the same need to hear a human voice confirm what the display already showed, because the alternative was that the display was wrong and there was still time. That's correct, Kindara. Hold position and stand by. The channel closed. The formation reshaped. On the sensor plot, the flock reacted. The 14 raiders massed in the trailing arc, the ones I was aiming at, shifted, circled, their patrol patterns stuttering as the convoy's new shape registered. The surrender rotation had stalled. Mass where there should have been empty space. The careful architecture the flock had spent weeks building, undone by 3 ships sitting in positions that made no tactical sense unless you knew what was behind them. The flock tried to adapt. Raiders peeled off from the trailing cluster, probing the convoy's flanks, looking for the pressure points that had worked before. But the formation had changed shape in a way the flock's harvested data couldn't account for. I'd moved the most valuable ships into the most dangerous position, which was the opposite of every repositioning decision I'd made since the convoy formed. The flock's model of my behavior was wrong for the first time in weeks, and the hesitation showed. Raiders circled without committing. The trailing cluster contracted, tightening as the outlying units pulled back toward the group. Concentrating. I watched the cluster density climb on my display. 14 raiders becoming a tighter formation. 1,200 meters across. 1,100. 900. Davy. I didn't look away from the sensor plot. Spinal gun to firing mode. Target, trailing raider cluster, bearing 195. Range 31,000. Fire on my command. Davy's hands moved across his console. The crucible shuddered as the spinal capacitor banks aligned with the main discharge rail. The lights on the bridge dimmed briefly as power systems prioritized the weapon. Gun is hot. Targeting solution locked. Ready on your command. The flock cluster was at 800 meters spread, still contracting. The bore axis ran through the center of the formation, through the Oral, through the Vestane, through the Kindara, and into the cluster beyond. Galt came on comms, the Vestane's captain. He didn't ask if the formation plot was correct. He knew what a bore axis was. Kos, my crew is requesting permission to evacuate to the nearest convoy ship before... Negative. There's no time. The window is closing and any shuttle launch in the bore axis will disrupt the targeting solution. I paused. One breath. I'm sorry, Galt. Silence on the channel. Then, understood. And nothing else. Davy, fire. The crucible fired. The spinal discharge hit space as a column of directed energy that left the bow of the battleship in a single pulse, lasting less than a quarter second, moving at a velocity that made distance a formality. Light rode along it as a byproduct. The bridge displays whited out. The structural vibration peaked and died. And then the sensor feed came back and showed me what I'd done. The bore axis was empty. Where the Oral had been, a spreading cloud of rubble glowing at the edges, already cooling. The medical frigate had been a 400-meter vessel carrying 60 crew and surgical facilities that could handle everything from crush injuries to radiation sickness. The discharge had passed through her center mass and converted her into expanding gas and tumbling fragments in the same quarter second it took to reach the next target. The Vestan was gone. Galt and his crew and his repurposed medical bays and every milligram of pharmaceutical stock the convoy had left. Gone in the same pulse, the same light, the rubble fields merging with the Orals, because the two ships had been positioned close enough that the discharge cone caught them both without distinction. The Kindara had been the largest of the three. The Ark, the cryogenetic library, the embryo banks, the frozen seed stock from Risoria Station. The genetic future Desh had called a freezer full of embryos, and I had called irreplaceable. The discharge hit her broadside. The cryo-storage hull, designed to maintain stable temperatures across centuries, shattered in a way that the sensors rendered as a brief, symmetrical bloom. Cold material meeting catastrophic energy, the expansion pattern almost beautiful if you didn't know what the fragments had been. Beyond the rubble, the trailing flock cluster. The discharge had passed through the three ships and into the raiders, with enough energy to make the intervening destruction irrelevant. The sensor plot updated in a cascade of dying contacts, red icons winking out, fragmenting, scattering. 14 raiders in the cluster's core, packed into an 800-meter formation that the spinal gun's discharge cone covered like a closed fist. 11 kills confirmed in the first 2 seconds. 2 more breaking apart over the following minute, their structures compromised, their drive signatures failing. 1 survivor, damaged, spinning, its silhouette on the sensor display showing a body half stripped of hull plating, trailing rubble as it tumbled away from the kill zone. The remaining 8 raiders, the ones that had been probing the convoy's flanks when the gun fired, broke. Instantly, simultaneously, as if a signal had passed between them. They turned and burned for deep space, accelerating away from the convoy on divergent headings, their formation dissolving into individual flight paths, scattering, running. The sensor plot cleared. The red crescent that had surrounded the convoy for weeks was gone, replaced by a handful of fading contacts on the plot's outer edge, already approaching the limits of detection. The trailing rubble field, ship fragments, radar wreckage, cooling gas, drifted in the convoy's wake, marking the place where the Bohr axis had carved its line through everything in its path. I stared at the plot. The tally in my head updated. 34 ships before the shot. 31 after. The Oral, the Vestane, the Kindara, subtracted by the same weapon that was supposed to protect them, in the same quarter-second discharge, killed by the same officer who had spent weeks keeping them in the safest position in the formation. 22 raiders before the shot, 8 surviving, all fleeing, 1 damaged and tumbling, 13 confirmed kills. Brassard stood at the command station. He hadn't moved during the firing sequence, he hadn't spoken. Now he looked at the plot, looked at the rubble fields, looked at the empty berths where 3 blue icons had been. Tadi, signal all ships. Weapons discharge complete. All vessels hold position and report status. The reports came in. 31 ships. Hull integrity confirmed across the fleet. No collateral damage beyond the Bohr axis. The Halleck, the fuel tanker I'd managed to reposition outside the cone, reported a minor thermal wash across her port side from the discharge proximity. No structural compromise. Davy powered down the spinal gun. The capacitor banks began their recharge cycle. Weeks of vulnerability ahead. Pell tracked the fleeing raiders. 8 contacts dispersing. They'd regroup somewhere beyond sensor range. They'd breed from whatever rubble they could scavenge. They'd come back, smaller, weaker, but carrying everything the consumed ships had taught them. The formation histories, the comm protocols, the surrender posture. All of it still in their systems, waiting to be used again. The convoy was alive, gutted, stripped of medical ships, genetic reserves, surgical capacity, seed stock, embryo banks, but alive. 15,000 people in 31 hulls, crawling through deep space toward a destination that might not exist anymore, protected by a gun that would take weeks to fire again, and a tactical officer who had just destroyed the 3 most important ships in the fleet with a single, precisely calculated shot. Brassard crossed to my station. He stood there for a moment, not looking at the plot or the data, just standing. Next formation recommendation? I pulled up a fresh plot. The convoy needed reshaping. The Bohr axis gap had to be closed, the inner ring rebuilt around whatever assets still qualified as critical. The Halleck, the Laramine with her 2,000 passengers, the ore carriers with their raw materials. A new triage hierarchy for a convoy that had lost the things that made the old hierarchy meaningful. I started working. The formation plot filled with new lines, new positions, new calculations. The same math, the same process. The ships had changed, the priorities had changed, but the work was the same. Arranging the living into a shape that would determine who survived the next time the flock came, and the time after that, and the time after that, until the convoy reached wherever it was going, or the flock finished what it had started. Davy reported the recharge estimate, extended after a full discharge. 23 days to full charge. 23 days of point defense and formation, and whatever the flock had left to throw at us. Pell reported the last fleeing raider dropping off the sensor plot's edge. Gone. For now. I finished the new formation and transmitted it. 31 ships began repositioning. Blue icons shuffling across the display, finding their new berths, settling into the shape I'd drawn for them. The Laramine moved to the inner ring. Desch's liner, the ship I'd called non-critical, now the highest population vessel in the convoy, and therefore the most valuable by the only metric that still mattered. Maybe he'd noticed the promotion. Maybe he'd understand what it had cost. The plot stabilized. The convoy held. I sat at the tactical console and watched the formation hold its shape against the drift of 31 ships crewed by people who were tired and frightened, and running out of reasons to trust the man giving orders. The gun was 23 days from ready. The flock was out there, somewhere beyond the sensor plot, rebuilding. And I was here, doing the one thing I'd discovered I was built for, the thing I'd crossed a sector to escape, the thing that came to me the way water finds a channel, clean and quick, and without mercy. The recharge clock started. I pulled up the threat projections and began planning for the next attack.